In the autumn of 1903, on the flat prairie east of Linden Creek, Saskatchewan, a 43-year-old grain farmer named Everett Munn spent the last of his savings, $80 and some change, on a derelict ferry crossing that everyone in town said was already finished. The river had shifted 2 seasons back, people said. The current ran shallow in summer and froze solid from October to March. Nobody crossed there anymore. Nobody needed to. Everett Munn, who had not spoken more than 12 words in any single conversation since his wife died of fever, 3 years prior, walked into the land registry office on a Tuesday morning and signed the papers before anyone could talk him out of it. The clerk watched him fold the deed into his breast pocket and said, with genuine concern, that the crossing hadn't earned $1 since the mill closed. Everett nodded once and left. The town of Linden Creek did not hold its tongue. It never had. By Wednesday, people were saying he had gone soft in the head from too many winters alone. By Thursday, they had moved on to saying he deserved whatever came of it, because a man who bought a dead crossing on a shifted river wasn't looking for profit. He was looking for somewhere to disappear quietly. The postmaster told the barber, and the barber told everyone who sat in his chair for the next 2 weeks that Everett Munn had always been a strange one, kept to himself, didn't come to town meetings, didn't drink, didn't argue, just worked his land, paid his debts on time, and looked at people the way a man looks at weather he has already decided how to dress for. What Linden Creek did not know, what it could not have known, because Everett had not told a living soul, was that he had stood on the bank of that crossing the evening before he bought it and watched the river for nearly an hour in the cold. He had not been looking at the water. He had been listening to it, and in the sound of it, slow and certain in the autumn dark, he had heard something he had not heard in 3 years. Something that sounded faintly like a reason. He moved his few things out to the crossing by the end of the week. The old ferryman's shelter sat at the east bank, boards warped, one window gone. The stovepipe bent sideways at an angle that suggested the last resident had left in some hurry. Everett straightened the pipe with his hands in a length of wire. He found where the boards had split and packed the gaps with what he had. The first night, the wind came through the walls in thin, cold lines, and he sat at the small table with a lamp and ate bread and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. He did not sleep well. He rarely did anymore. In the morning he walked the bank in both directions, reading the river the way his father had taught him to read soil, where it pressed hard, where it gave, where the bottom had shifted, and where it had settled. The crossing wasn't dead. It was just moved. The current had swung 30 feet north over 2 seasons, carrying the deep channel with it. But the old ford, the flat, graveled run where wagons used to cross, had silted up only at the near edge. Dig it clear, build the approach out 12 feet, and the crossing lived again. He started digging the next morning. It was the kind of work that did not invite conversation, which suited him fine. Shovel and cold water, and the sound of gravel moving. His back ached by noon, and his hands were numb by mid-afternoon, and he kept going because stopping meant thinking and thinking. In the autumn of 1903 still had a way of leading him to places he could not afford to go alone. He was 3 days into the work when the girl arrived. He heard the horse first, not a clean hoofbeat but a ragged, stumbling thing. The sound of an animal moving on the wrong side of exhausted. He straightened from the bank and turned, and in the gray morning light, he saw a bay mare picking her way down the trail from the north road, her head hanging, her coat dark with dried sweat. The woman on her back sat very still, one hand on the saddle horn, the other pressed flat against her own ribs, as if holding something in. She did not call out. She did not ask for help. She simply rode to the edge of the bank and stopped there, and the mare stopped with her, and they both stood very still in the way of things that have run out of forward. Everett set down his shovel. He walked up the bank without hurrying. He took in the mare's breathing, labored but not broken. and the woman's face, which was pale and set and gave away nothing except that she had been holding whatever expression she was wearing for a very long time. "You need to get down," he said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken in several days. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and direct, the kind of eyes that did not look away from things. She was somewhere in her early 30s, he thought, though something in the way she held herself suggested she had aged past her years in ways that did not show on her face. "My horse needs water," she said, as if that were the only relevant fact. He brought the mare water in a bucket and held it while she drank. Then he brought a second. While the horse drank the third, the woman dismounted, slowly, one hand still at her ribs. She stood without swaying, which he suspected took more effort than it looked. Her name was Mabel Stroud. She told him that much when he asked, and then she told him nothing else. He did not ask again. She had been riding since before dawn. The mare, her name was Cinder, had come up lame sometime in the second hour, and then had pushed through it, which horses sometimes did when they had no other instruction. Mabel had a saddlebag with a change of clothes, a small tin of biscuits, and a document wallet that she kept close to her body in a way that was not accidental. The wallet was worn at the corners. Whatever was in it mattered. He offered her the shelter. She refused it. He offered her the chair by the stove. She sat down without answering, which he took as acceptance. He made tea. She drank it. Cinder stood outside the shelter, tied loosely to the fence post, and after a while she stopped trembling. Mabel Stroud did not explain herself that first day, and Everett Munn did not require it. He fed the horse and went back to his digging, and when evening came he made a simple meal and set a plate at the table and did not comment on whether she ate or not. She ate. He cleaned up. Outside, the prairie went dark and quiet, and the river ran on in its steady way. And that was all. It was 3 days before he understood the shape of what had followed her there. The first sign was the rider who appeared on the north road, late on the second morning. He stopped at the top of the trail, looked down at top of the crossing, looked at the shelter, and then turned and went back the way he had come without descending. He sat his horse with the particular ease of a man who was being paid for his patience, and patience was not something he was worried about running out of. Everett watched from the bank and said nothing. Mabel saw it too. He could tell by the way she went still beside the stove that evening, the way her hand paused before she turned the page of the book she was not really reading. "That man works for Clement Busby," she said finally. Her voice was flat and even. Everett put down his tea. He waited. Clement Busby owned the grain elevator in Linden Creek and the livery, and 3 sections of land north of the river, and, depending on who you asked, most of the conversation that happened in the town's 2 churches on Sunday morning. He was 61 years old, well-dressed, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been told no in a way that stuck. Mabel had been his housekeeper. She said this quietly, staring at the table. She had been his housekeeper for 2 years, and in that time she had managed his accounts as well as his household, because the previous man he'd hired for the accounts had drunk himself out of competence. And Mabel had a head for numbers that she had never been encouraged to develop, but had developed anyway. She was good at it. Too good, it turned out. Good enough that she began to notice things. The flour weights were short, not by much. Not enough that any one farmer would think to question it. A bushel here, half a bushel there. A pattern so small and so consistent, it was nearly invisible unless you were the person writing it down every week and comparing it to what should have been received. She wrote it down. She kept a copy. When she told him she knew, Clement Busby had looked at her across his dining room table with the particular expression of a man deciding what category you belonged to, whether you were a problem to be bought or a problem to be moved. He tried to buy her first. She refused. Then things began to happen. A letter arrived, addressed to her at the post office, signed with a name she didn't know, accusing her of theft from the household accounts. A man she recognized from Busby's land office began appearing near the boarding house where she lived. And then one morning the boarding house landlady, a decent woman named Mrs. Cook, who had always been kind, told Mabel with genuine apology in her eyes that she could not renew her room. The landlady would not say why. She didn't have to. Mabel had left before sunrise with Cinder and her document wallet, and no clear destination. Because when a town decides to close its doors against you, you ride until you find somewhere that hasn't decided yet. Everett listened to all of this without speaking. When she finished, the lamp between them had burned lower, and outside the river moved steadily in the dark. He asked to see the documents. She hesitated. She had carried them alone for long enough that showing them to someone felt like setting down a weight she wasn't sure she was ready to release. Then she opened the wallet and laid the papers on the table, one by one, in order. He was not a fast reader, but he was thorough. He read everything twice. He looked at the dates, the tallies, the pattern she had marked in her careful hand. When he finished, he straightened the pages and set them back in front of her without comment. "These are real," he said. That was all he said, but he said it the way a man says something he is prepared to stand behind. She put the papers back. She did not thank him. She did not need to. The rider came back the next morning. This time he came all the way down the trail and stopped at the near bank. He was a large man, slope-shouldered, with a face arranged into an expression of professional pleasantness that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Busby sends his regards," the man said to Everett, ignoring Mabel entirely in the way of someone who had been told to perform a kind of theater. "He says the woman staying with you has some papers that belong to his estate. He'd like them returned." No fuss made. Everett stood on the bank with his shovel and looked at the man. He let the silence run out a few extra seconds, the way a man does when he is not uncomfortable with silence and he wants you to know it. "She isn't staying with me," Everett said. "She's resting her horse, and I don't know anything about any papers." The man's pleasant expression held. "There's money in this," he said, "for the right kind of cooperation." Everett looked at him a moment longer, then went back to digging. The rider sat his horse for another minute before turning back up the trail. That afternoon, Everett went to Linden Creek for the first time since he had bought the crossing. He went to the office of a solicitor named William Vance, who had a single room above the hardware store and a reputation for being the only lawyer in 100 miles who would take a case he believed in before he was certain he could win it. Everett sat across from him and explained what he knew in as few sentences as possible. Vance listened. He asked 3 questions. Then he asked to see the documents. He'd need to bring them, Everett said. "Who has them?" "The woman. She's at the crossing." Vance studied him for a moment. "And she's agreed to this?" "Not yet." Vance leaned back in his chair. "She'll need to agree." "I know," Everett said. He stood and put on his hat. He rode back to the crossing in the late afternoon, the prairie wide and gray around him, the smell of coming cold in the air. He could see the shelter from half a mile out, small and straight against the flat horizon, the smoke from the stovepipe rising thin and steady. Mabel was standing at the river's edge when he arrived, watching the water move. Cinder was grazing behind the shelter, moving slow and easy, which meant her legs were better. Mabel turned when she heard his horse and waited while he dismounted. He told her about Vance. He told her straight, without softening it, because she was not a woman who needed things softened. She needed them accurate. She listened. The river ran between them and the far bank, and beyond the far bank the sky was going orange and purple in the west. "If I do this," she said finally, "they'll say I'm making it up. A woman with no standing against a man who owns half the county." Everett looked at the river. "There's a difference between winning and being right," he said. "Vance knows that difference. He doesn't take cases he thinks are wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it, not for long, but he thought about it honestly, the way he did things. "Because the papers are real," he said, "and you didn't make anything up." She looked at him steadily. "That's all?" He picked up his shovel, which was leaning against the fence post. "That's enough," he said. The next morning they rode together to Linden Creek. They drew looks on the main street, and the looks were not kind. Mabel rode straight-backed with the document wallet held across her saddle, looking at no one in particular, and at everything at once, the way you learn to look when you had been watched with bad intent long enough. Everett rode beside her, and said nothing, and looked at anyone who looked too long, which was enough. Vance met them in his office and spent 2 hours with the papers. He made copies in his own hand. He asked Mabel to walk him through her accounting system, and she did, clearly and without embellishment, her memory of the figures precise enough that Vance stopped writing at one point and simply listened, his pen held still in his hand. "This is straightforward," Vance said when she finished. He did not mean easy. He meant the facts were clear. Busby's response came within the week. A letter to Vance, professionally worded, proposing that the woman in question had misunderstood certain accounting practices common to the grain trade, and that her copies were incomplete and taken without authorization, and that this matter could be resolved quietly if the documents were returned and the appropriate confidentiality observed. Vance read the letter aloud in his office, with Mabel and Everett present. When he finished reading, he set it down on his desk. "He offered you money to go away," Vance said to Mabel. "I know," she said. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the window. Outside, Linden Creek moved through its morning the way it always had, indifferent to what happened in small offices above hardware stores. "I want the farmers to know," she said. "The ones whose grain was short. They deserve to know." Vance picked up his pen. "Then we proceed." What followed was not quick. It was methodical and quiet and unglamorous, the way truth usually worked when it worked at all. Vance filed with the Land Title Office and wrote to the Grain Inspections Authority in Regina. Everett drove out to 3 farms north of the river and knocked on doors, and said only what was necessary. That there was a matter before a solicitor, that the evidence was documented, that the farmers might want to speak with Vance before they decided what to think. He did not persuade anyone. He simply made the information available and let people do with it what they would. Clement Busby came to the crossing himself on a Thursday morning. He came alone, which surprised Everett. Busby was not the kind of man who went anywhere alone. He was 61, and solid and accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence, and he rode down the trail with the bearing of a man who had decided that this matter had gone on long enough, and that his personal attention would resolve it. He stopped at the bank and looked at Everett. "You've involved yourself in something that doesn't concern you," Busby said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Everett looked up from the crossing work. He studied Busby the way he studied anything he needed to understand, thoroughly, without rushing. "A woman came to the crossing with proof that people were being cheated," he said. "That concerns the river. The river concerns me." Busby's expression shifted slightly, from condescension to something more considered. He was, whatever else he was, not a stupid man. "I'll give you fair value for this land," Busby said. "Above fair. You can take the money and go back to farming. No one needs to know you were involved." Everett looked at the crossing, the approach he had dug clear, the new planking he had begun to lay, the water running clean and cold over the gravel he had moved a shovelful at a time. "I already bought it," he said. "I'm not selling." Busby sat his horse for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You understand what I can do to a man in this county who goes against me?" Everett picked up his shovel. "I expect so," he said. He went back to work. Busby did not move for a while. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the trail without another word. Mabel had watched from the sheltered doorway. When Busby was gone, she came out and stood at the bank. "He'll go to the sheriff," she said. "Probably," Everett agreed. He did. The sheriff came out 2 days later with a deputy and a complaint about unauthorized occupation of the crossing property. A claim that Everett was able to answer with his deed, which he kept folded in his breast pocket and produced without drama. The sheriff read it twice, returned it, and told Busby's man who had ridden out with him that the matter of the land appeared to be in order. The complaint about the document was a civil matter, he said, and not one he was prepared to act on until the courts had spoken. The courts took 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Everett finished the approach to the crossing and laid new planking over the first 20 feet of the ford. He patched the remaining gaps in the shelter walls. He repaired the fence. A farmer named George Picard, who ran cattle north of the river and had been using the longer route around since the crossing went quiet, came by one afternoon to look at the work and ended up staying 2 hours, helping carry timber. He didn't ask questions. When he left, he said he would tell people the crossing was open again. Mabel helped where she could. She was not a woman who sat still when there was work to be done, and she had a practical intelligence that expressed itself in exactly the right kind of help. Not too much, not performing, just present and accurate. She organized the supplies. She kept the records of what had been spent and what remained. She was good at it, and she did not hide that she was good at it. One evening, they sat at the small table with the lamp between them and the river going on outside, and Everett said, without looking up from the map he was studying, "You have a better head for accounting than anyone I've hired." She looked at him. "You haven't hired anyone." "No," he said. She understood what he meant. She did not answer immediately. The lamp burned between them, and outside the prairie was very still. The hearing in Moose Jaw was a Tuesday in November. The room was small and cold, and smelled of coal smoke and damp coats. 3 farmers sat in the gallery, Picard among them, men who had reviewed their own records with Vance's guidance and found the discrepancies Mabel had documented. Clement Busby sat at one table with his lawyer. Mabel sat at another with Vance. Everett sat in the gallery and kept his hat in his hands. Busby's lawyer spoke first. He was practiced and smooth, and made a careful argument about record-keeping complexity, and the good character of his client, and the unreliability of accounts kept by an employee without formal authorization. He gestured at Mabel with the particular dismissiveness of a man who had learned that treating a woman as negligible was a reliable strategy. Vance presented the evidence without theatrics. He went figure by figure through the records. He presented a calculation that showed the cumulative shortfall across 2 years and named the sum. He called Mabel to speak, and she spoke clearly and without hurry, answering each question precisely, her memory of the numbers exact and unshaken. Busby's lawyer interrupted twice. Both times the magistrate told him to wait. When Mabel finished, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something true has been said plainly enough that there is no comfortable response to it. Busby leaned to his lawyer and said something low. His lawyer shook his head. The magistrate reviewed the papers for a long time. Then he asked Busby a question about a specific transfer date. Busby answered. The date did not match the record. The magistrate asked again. Busby gave a different date. The magistrate set the paper down and looked at him. He is not angry, Mabel thought. He is finished. The ruling came the following week by letter. The discrepancies were confirmed as systematic. The matter was referred to the Grain Inspection Authority. Restitution to the affected parties was ordered. No criminal finding was made. The magistrate had chosen his jurisdiction carefully, but the referral was enough. The Grain Inspection Authority would not be quiet about what it found, and Clement Busby's elevator would not survive the audit that followed with its license intact. The letter reached the crossing on a Friday afternoon. Vance had sent a copy directly, with a note at the bottom in his careful hand. The record will reflect what occurred. That is usually enough. Mabel read it twice and set it on the table. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "It's done." Everett was mending the second length of fence along the bank. He looked up. "Is it what you wanted?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "It's what was right," she said. "I think that's what I wanted." He went back to the fence. After a moment, she came out and handed him the next section of wire, and they worked in silence in the cold afternoon. the river moving steadily at the edge of the light. Linden Creek noticed the change before anyone announced it. The men who had sent their grain to Busby's elevator began speaking differently on the main street, not loudly, and not with anything that sounded like apology. That was not how this town apologized. But, with the particular adjustment of people who have realized they were wrong about the direction the current was running. George Picard mentioned, in the feed store, that the crossing had good new planking and was worth using again. A woman who had once told her neighbor that Mabel Stroud had probably been skimming from the accounts, herself went quiet on that subject and found other things to discuss. No one came to the crossing to say sorry. They came with other things. A neighbor brought extra nails. A rancher stopped by to ask about rates for using the ford. A woman from town arrived with a jar of preserves and said she had heard the shelter needed a window pane, and could she send her husband on Saturday. Everett said yes to all of it, without making anything of it. Mabel watched this happen and said little. She had lived long enough in places that had turned against her to be cautious about places turning back. Trust, she had learned, was a thing you gave out a piece at a time, and only after you had watched what a place did with the first piece before you gave the next. But the window went in on Saturday, and the nails were good, and the rancher who used the crossing paid what was fair and said so, plainly. One evening, in early December, with the first snow down, and the fire burning steady in the shelter stove, Mabel spread papers across the table. Not the documents from Busby's accounts, but a set of clean ledger pages she had bought in town. She had drawn columns and was working through a set of figures with a pencil, her head bent close to the lamp. Everett looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What are you planning?" he asked. She did not look up. This crossing could carry twice the traffic it does now if the far approach were cleared and the planking extended by 20 feet. The toll income would cover the material cost in 2 seasons. He set down the harness. He looked at the pages she had marked. 3 seasons, he said. She looked up. She had already considered this. The Picard cattle come through twice a year. Add those 2 seasons. He was quiet. Then he reached out and turned one of the pages toward him. He read the figures. He read them again. "You'd need someone to manage the books," he said. "I'm already managing them." The lamp burned between them. Outside, the snow came down soft and even, and the river still moved beneath its new skin of ice, slower now but present, finding the path it had always been looking for. He looked at her across the table. "I think this crossing stays," he said. She met his eyes. She had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to hear someone say something like that. Not about the crossing, but about the quality of things that remain when everything else has been stripped away. "I think so too," she said. Winter settled over the high prairie. The river froze hard enough to walk on, and for a while the crossing was quiet. But Everett had built it for the thaw, and when the thaw came it was ready. Spring brought water, and the water brought crossings, and the crossings brought people. And slowly and without ceremony the ferry landing at Linden Creek came back to what it had been before the current shifted, and then in time, a little more. Mabel kept the books. She kept them with the same precision she had always kept accounts. And this time, the people who relied on those numbers knew whose hand had written them. The farmers north of the river knew. Vance knew. George Picard, who had become something like a regular fixture at the crossing on market days, knew. The town learned to say her name without dropping its voice. Everett worked the land and worked the crossing and spoke when something needed to be said and was quiet when it didn't, and those around him came to understand that his silences were not absence but attention. That he was a man who gave things the full weight of his thought before he opened his mouth, and that when he did speak it was worth listening. Some years later, when their daughter asked Mabel to tell the story of how the crossing came to be what it was, Mabel sat for a moment, with her hands still in her lap, the lamp burning on the table the same as it always had. "Your father," she said, finally, bought a crossing that everyone said was finished. He bought it because he heard something in the river that other people weren't listening for. And because of that, we had somewhere to be when we needed it most. The daughter thought about this. What did he hear? She asked. Mabel looked toward the window, and beyond it, the river, which was still going in its steady way, under ice or over stone finding its course. A reason, she said. That was enough to start with. Outside, the water kept moving, and the crossing held, and what had been dismissed as finished turned out to be something else entirely, a thing waiting to be chosen by someone willing to listen.